Welcome to another guidance segment with the 2MK team. Today we are looking at our UNIST bots once again. If you would like the inputs for this particular bot, this is the Wagner type bot. You will be able to find it on Sunday when we release, with multiple pages with all of the inputs. Or if you would like to poke at it before then, you can reference our stream of 2 weeks ago Friday, Robotics Lab, for that information. Therefore, we're going to get straight into actually demonstrating what the bot is for and how it's supposed to be used today. Since you do have to input the bot every time you want to use UNIST bots, we have been working for the last 2 weeks on verifying the specifics in terms of difficulty of inputting these commands and what happens if they're consistent enough, how you can tell whether or not they're consistent enough, and so on. Today we are starting with Orie. Our Orie bot is approximately the easiest to start with. As noted, we will not be showing off the specifics of inputs, as you would have to put them in every time either way, and the game does not actually show the inputs related to the bot to help you in any way. So, we're simply going to go through quickly across all of the bots we have today that use the same inputs and explain their specifics in terms of point systems, some of which are not completely yet verified, but definitely will be by the time we release them. And things you may notice, ways to look for things that might be a little bit off in terms of your bot, or that could be changed in order to be useful to you in a different way. So with all that said, your aim with Orie bot, regardless of your character, should generally be to start with doing an assault from the ground. This is forward and D. To get into the air, to go for what is equivalent of a jumping attack, hit this attack, and go into a combo. Orie moves around quite a lot, puts shields and somewhat zoning around herself, has good buttons for keeping you out while you're doing this, and depending on the aerial moves of your character, often dodges or ducks under your assault strikes. So finding that specific timing and space to get in on her is not really something you'd want to spend a lot of time doing on the character as a whole, but as a result, she makes a good bot for the purpose in that it's hard to do. This bot's input does not do her divine thrust very often, but it is in there, and you will occasionally see it. What she does often is go into the air, and she has a lot of aerial mobility and a lot of aerial shifts. She can make sure that she is in a different position using her force function, as well as activating Thanatos, as you see there, to change her downward trajectory and timing. in the early parts of practice when you're getting used to using your buttons. You can also use your anti-air buttons against her uppercut style move in order to get used to it. At the easiest level of the bot, as you know, we tend to put difficulty levels on them. At the easiest level, you can treat this as an anti-air, since the aim at that point is to learn how to make those things work, hit combos, understand how to convert off your opponent being at a particular height, and using your 3C or 5C depending on your character. A couple other characters do use different buttons for the anti-air. But in general, you want to try to get as clear an advantage as possible, and most characters do not get their maximum advantage on this type of anti-air by just using a special. So, the point system is about learning to get that advantage, learning to punish using those normals. And finally, to punish the Divine Thrust itself, which is a matter more so of awareness than anything else. The move is easy to make safe, but she can occasionally be in a dangerous place where you can at least check her if she was too close. And your aim should be to learn to do this more so as a reaction to seeing that move, as it is quite quick, and unless your opponent is spamming it, it may take you by surprise. As you can see, she often puts out the ceiling hop-on, making it difficult for you to use that assault to get in. But you can use this to learn as much as possible about it. We have not finalized yet how you can actually tell in terms of how many points to count to or how to manage the health bars, given that the regeneration cannot be set per character. It's either on or off, and even if you set your health very low, as long as auto regeneration is on, you will not actually get KO'd even if it falls to 0. So, while that is still under discussion, we encourage people to find their own creative ways of limiting themselves in terms of getting to their 10 points, or just count to 10 and basically recognize how long it took them to get there or how many times they made mistakes. This game has enough of an awareness requirement that we do not suggest that we use anything for beginner players that involves them counting when the bot gets a point. We do, however, like to use the 30% or 20% health setting because it gives you a clearer idea of when you've made mistakes and is a little helpful psychologically, as we're used to paying attention to our health more when it gets quite low. So it's easier to feel as if it's tenser or as if you're making a mistake, even though it's not actually going to result in you getting KO'd at any point and therefore cutting your training short. So returning to Orie, once again, the point system for this bot is to assault in. At the moment it is just from the ground. Land a full jump in combo. Optimization is preferred, but it's up to you which combo you use. The important thing we find is don't mash. You have to be relatively confident in what it is, and should be trying to at least do the same combo every time, even if you are not necessarily confident in your combo ability in the game yet. This will help you learn whether or not there are flaws in the combo, whether or not it can only be confirmed under certain circumstances, what happens to you when the opponent goes into the air and you hit maybe the first part and whiff the second, how much danger you're in, as she does do quite a lot of moves, and so on. Anti-airs are a relatively easy and somewhat common requirement. Jumps in this game are kind of fast, And hesitation is often a big problem, but against Orie you do have to hesitate a little bit, as she often uses all of her options of moving around in the air to prevent you from being able to just anti-air immediately as soon as you see her go up. You can, however, air-to-air her a bit more often, and that may be less risky. This is also another point system, and as mentioned, punishing her Divine Thrust can be very important. Whether or not you train with the meters on or off is up to you. It only slightly changes things because obviously she's able to do the C version of Divine Thrust more often if she has constantly regenerating meter. This bot is unaffected by the settings of Vorpal, but it should generally be your habit to set Vorpal to default, or rather set the GRD gauge status to default, rather than to player Vorpal. However, if you forget against most of the bots, it makes no difference. Similarly, she does not have her main meter using C options in ways that tend to matter, meaning that the fact that you have regenerating meter is generally not going to make her too strange or too difficult to deal with. Therefore, it really is as simple as it sounds, and therefore we can now move on to Akatsuki as our next bot to be demoed. Once again, note that even though you do have to put in the bot anew every time you turn on this game, you do not have to put it in per character unless you are changing from one type to another, and in this stream we are only demonstrating the Wagner type input. We have labeled it this for specific reasons. But in the case of this one, we will in fact be changing the GRD gauge to default. And probably might as well turn the auto-regenerating EXS gauge off as well. Akatsuki will be important for understanding the standard style of game, the footsie style of game. We are using Yuzuru for this, which makes it a little bit easier to do one of the things involved, but it's still not simplistic. In general, your aim against this character is to whiff punish his longer strikes, his kicks usually, with one of your own, and combo off that, your hit confirming. When he sticks out a button, you whiff punish it, and then you have to strike. He's also good for other forms of practice, and often if you end up blocking his uppercut style move, in this case you get the point for it, specifically because he sometimes does the light one, which does not take him very high into the air, is generally quick to animate, and doesn't have any notable difference visually for most people to the other one, meaning that you take a little longer to react to him doing it. You are not limited to getting points only when he uses the light version of that move, but if you want to get enough points, you often will have to do it. Aside from that, you are aiming to punish his very close range projectile, a relatively occasional thing. He normally should do his projectile from further away. But if he does do it on the ground from quite close for any reason, it is actually probably -6 at best, depending on which one he does. He can make it safer by doing it at the end of a block string, but this bot generally will not do this move in a block string situation, meaning that you are generally able to punish it if you see it. There may be a block string, but it's not going to be one of the good ones that causes this move to be safe enough that you will not be able to poke at him. The interesting thing about this game is that unlike games like Street Fighter where it is more common for the character to have at least something that definitely punishes that 6 frames of disadvantage, these games not only do not always have that easily available, it's not very universal. Some characters can do it with mediums, some characters can only do it with lights. A few characters have specials that can do it, but the majority of specials also do not actually do this punish. Therefore, minor differences in how plus or minus he is after doing certain moves make a big difference in terms of what you're able to do against it. The final part of the point system is the most complex, even though it would seem quite simple. His armor-piercing kick can actually only be standardly punished when he does the C version. The other versions of this move, you must shield it in order to punish it, which is our first introduction to that mechanic, basically hitting and holding D while blocking. Normally you are doing it to intercept the move, but for certain multi-hit moves, and this being one of those moves, you can realize it's happening and hold D at the correct time during it. When you do this, your own block stun is reduced, making it possible for you to punish the move. You will notice this has happened because of a large green flash around your character that tells you that you have succeeded and that you can attempt your punish. We suggest that you read up on how this function works if you're getting into this game, if you don't already know, or check out the tutorials about it in order to understand what it really lets you do in terms of frame data shifts. Or of course, you can take the organic route, which is the purpose of the bots at least somewhat, and just try to figure out what works and does not work by experimentation. There is the A version of this move which basically only hits once, but you can still, most of the time, if you were expecting to need to guard it. Many players can in fact manage to shield this move, even at that point. Just understand that the C version, which is really obvious, can be punished, and the others, if you didn't shield, you probably cannot do it. This character is also good for getting used to the concepts of footsies in this game. If you're coming from other games that move a little slower, that you're used to this sort of thing already, he's a good way to get started once you've understood extra options such as your assault and the various air options you might find from Orie. You can see him playing in what is more or less a standard way. He also helps you get used to the idea that not every low sweep style attack is necessarily something that you get a huge advantage against. If spaced well, or depending on your ability to recognize the animation, you may not be able to punish this, and your opponent does often get some relatively weird combos out of doing it. Utilizing your own combos most effectively is the way to get points against this bot, but it is because of something like that that we are somewhat concerned about how to actually set up the health, as if you're playing this bot correctly, he will be defeated long before you reach 10 points. Therefore, we suggest that you keep the health recovery on, at least for him. You think this is universal, but there is in fact a bot where you could turn that health recovery off and even set both your health to 100% and still try to play the bot exactly as intended. So, once again, to repeat the point system, he will do his invincible uppercut style move. Full punish on that. Learn to whiff punish when he sticks out buttons, usually kicks, and to confirm off of those. If he happens to throw a minimum range blitz shot, his projectile, your character is probably able to hit him. If you are playing a longer range character like Yuzuriha, it's probably your 5A or 2A, and if you're playing one of the more rushdown characters, such as Seth, you will probably be able to do it with 5B. If you're not familiar with the frame data, you'll find most of this on Mizumi.net in the Under Night in Birth section. Make sure that you're looking at UNIST and not UNIL. It is possible to reach the UNIL pages still. But usually if you just search, clearly you will find the UNIST page and all of the associated frame data will be up on it. Even if you're not familiar with frame data, most of the time the only thing you need to be able to understand is which move it is and start up. Frame advantage is not necessarily required on your side for bots, as bots are generally not going to punish you. But let us, as mentioned, switch the health around, set health back to 100% on the player's side, and turn off our health recovery and move on to our Seth bot. Whereas Akatsuki and Orie are meant to teach you the basics of UNIST movement and specifics of new spacings and new tools, Seth is intended to help you get back to the roots if you have played fighting games before, and a basic understanding of what is going on as a whole. Seth has one attack that dashes through to the other side of you, and generally can be punished by a character's 5B or 5C depending on the character. Nanase, for example, must punish with 2B. This is important primarily because the move does change how punishable it is based on where Seth was when he started it relative to your character. If you were in the middle of the distance he traveled, chances are you do get a punish, even if you have to be really tight timing on it. So generally you're looking out for that as the main thing you're supposed to be doing. But the secondary thing is that whenever Seth throws out one of his orbs, you should attempt to dash in and throw him as quickly as possible. This is not necessarily a full-on Seth tactic that we suggest using in a lot of matches, but getting used to how long you can move when the opponent sticks out buttons and slipping in with your dash relative to their buttons and not getting hit, as well as being aware of something else on the screen that is the trigger mentally for when you should do this, are all pieces to help you understand and get through the difficulty of learning to throw properly if you've played certain types of games before. UNIST inputs do not allow you to land or relatively to execute a throw while holding any of the down directions on the stick or D-pad, meaning that your throw must be neutral, forward, or back. For those of us who are used to being able to move in or dash in and then down back to block, and then simply use the throw if we see no action, this will become impossible, meaning that you do have to time it. Since you also still need to be able to dash up and block, it will help you change some of your muscle memory as to how to achieve this. These two things make up the core of how you fight Seth Bot. And as a result, since even though the throw does do quite a bit of damage, and you probably would defeat him if you banished every single one of them in about 6 or 7 rather than the quote-unquote intended 10, the occasional poke is also useful. The other two are much harder and very reactive. Seth does have, with this input, the highest chance of throwing you of all the bots. Orie does throw you, but Orie's is more of a setup and you'll tend to know it's happening. Seth will actually throw you in pressure. And most of the time, if he goes for this, he will not be throwable easily himself. At least not at the same timing, meaning that unlike many other games, generally when you expect to do this throw, you have to get the throw tech right. Well, when you expect Seth to do that throw. It'll be throw tech or basically nothing, as your own throw is likely to whiff and get you hit if you just smash it or try to swing it out because he is close to you. Therefore, you do get points for this throw tech, even though it is quite difficult to execute. And you get points for anti-airs, which would seem as if they should be simple, but he does not spend a lot of time in the air, and similar to Orie, he tends to move in ways that are counterintuitive once he's there. If you are highly aware though, you can often manage the anti-air. Unlike Orie, you do not get any points for air-to-air of Seth. This may change by the time we release it depending on our tests in terms of which characters need this option in order to properly fight him. But as this also does not do a lot of damage, generally you can still expect that you should be able to fight him on the same terms with the health and regeneration off and get the full experience.
Another reason why this works out really well is that once you have committed to the action of trying to throw Seth, you end up needing to be aware of when it goes away. If it goes away, then you don't really get the point now, do you? Because you didn't throw him in time. So there's also that extra time pressure of, oh, I want to get this point right now, but he can possibly poke me. But if I don't take the chance or read his rhythm, then I'll never get the point. So he's very much a bot that helps you learn how to deal with hesitation in this game more than anything.
Seth himself does not do a ton of damage. There are particular moments in setups, especially if you input the bot particularly well on that day, where he can do some long chains and cause some problems, but as a whole, you do not generally need to worry about being dismantled too heavily. Unless, of course, you turn his auto-regenerating meter on, in which case you might get comboed into his drive and die. But even this is not something that happens too often. Even if you do relatively good or strong combos off of his dashing slash style attack, you can still consider it fairly good and just continue either way. It also requires a high enough level of skill that if you find that he's being defeated too easily, and it's not because you're just counter hitting him out of luck or something in those moments, then you're probably doing quite well and don't really need to worry about it. You can just turn back on health regeneration and try to get more used to the idea of what is required, even with your strong conversions and combos. He is a bot definitely meant to help you learn to defend, to learn to keep up with the pace and seeming randomness of this game. If you've come from a slower game, it can seem a little overwhelming. But the bot itself will generally not execute a ton of setups or similar, and tends to just poke at air in front of him to be more effective at making you reposition yourself than anything else. You therefore can really play this as one long defense game without really being worried that you're doing it wrong. Meaning that if you are a defensive style player who's looking for that, he does do, when input correctly, enough lows, enough semi-tricky things in the air, and enough fake outs that you do have something to keep your mind occupied, even if all you're doing for a while is blocking. This will also help you become more familiar with the way that Seth's orbs work in general, as he does have his force function and is able to power up the orb so that it is not destroyed unless you hit Seth. Standardly, if you hit Seth's orbs, they go away. But you can do a little bit of practice to get used to the idea that maybe this particular one can't be destroyed that way. And furthermore, they too tend to fire off and then disappear a bit faster if he has charged that function. Stopping him from doing so is relatively easy, and therefore not really a point system for the bot. Depending on your own play, you can either try to hit him anyway, just poke him once or twice with a lighter attack of your own, or if you have the health regeneration on, go for a full combo, go for big damage if you can manage to get it. His position should be altered often enough that you have to think about different combos, different ranges, and confirms and similar, which can be useful. But do make sure that you're actually reacting to him doing this power-up. It is relatively long, so you shouldn't generally have to worry too much about the fact that you are just throwing out buttons. Most likely you will in fact be reacting if you are used to doing that sort of thing in these games. Especially if you've come from Akatsuki where your mind was already on things like with punishing and watching for particular moves. Note again that we're not really advocating that you generally just throw Seth when he has orb out. This is more so to get used to the idea of the movement involved in the throw and potential things. Seth also has a decent, though not particularly high chance of teching your throw to give you just enough experience in terms of what happens there. Similar to spacings and so on. he's quick enough that in a lot of situations, he's able to get the gold throw. This is something you should more or less research or look up, as it is beyond the scope of the stream. And despite him not using all of his moves in this setup, he actually has them all. Just that some are incredibly rare with these inputs. So you can still sometimes be surprised by him managing to get command grab on you or similar. Obviously, his movement is good at getting you to guard your legs, while still moving around and having to move around enough to get the points for making sure you are approximately in the range where his dashing slash will in fact be punishable in the way you expect it to. So, that does cover Seth, and therefore we'll move on to she who this bot type is named after. Wagner is the bot that spawned this input set, therefore it was custom made for her. It just happens to work really well with the other 5 characters we're showing off today. But despite that, it is not in fact something we came up with a goal. It was more so to make sure that we understood how to potentially get all the moves of a character available and did some experimentation. Fortunately, Wagner as a character has so many options that she is the equivalent of the advanced boss we have had before. She's not really intended to do any one thing and has so many options that the main thing you need to understand about her is her extremely good range and space coverage in neutral. And of course how to punish certain of her moves, because otherwise you might get bullied by a player who knows how to space them really well. She can power up her shield and sword, even if she's not super likely to do it in certain iterations of the input. And she can use her force function to smack you away in many situations. As for what your aim is when it comes to actually dealing with her though, this doesn't necessarily shift depending on whether or not her inputs are good. Your aim is the same. If your inputs for her are particularly good one day, you may find it to be harder. If they're not quite as good, you may find it to be easier to do a particular aspect of it. But as a whole, she should still function, even if you're not precisely on point. Therefore, as for what you are actually aiming to do, for this character you're aiming to get in, usually with a run and hit a low. Now, while you could do a lot of running moves in this game, many characters do have straight up running moves. We're specifically talking about running up to her and hitting her with what is effectively the max range low you can manage that will start a combo. This is not specifically because it's super easy to do this on her in general, though honestly with a lot of her space coverage and the way that she tends to charge things in neutral, it is one of the better options you have, as everything else is a little too telegraphed. The more important thing, however, is that in certain forms of the bot, if your input is really good, she will backdash in very specific situations, and if your input is relatively poor for the day, she will backdash in different situations. She always does backdash though. So your aim is to get in, to hit with the low, But if on the way in you have recognized that she has backdashed away, due to any number of things really, you should try to use your assault to pursue her as quickly as possible. This also somewhat applies to her back jump, but at the moment we are not absolutely sure that this is worth giving a point for. It is both extremely rare that you will get anything off it, and not directly a good idea for certain characters. Therefore we are limiting it at this point to doing it when you see she has moved away during your dash as a whole. You can also get points for punishing her uppercut style move, but you should only take this point if you have dashed in and blocked that move. Generally, keeping your health regenerating or not regenerating for this bot is entirely up to the player. If you find that your combos hit too well or she doesn't defend enough with your day's version of the inputs, you may want to turn it on so that she lasts long, and if she's frustrating you at every turn, uppercutting you out of everything, and generally being a pain, you can probably leave it off, as she's more likely to defeat you first and cause all of the related feelings. In terms of regenerating excess gauge, this bot is slightly more interesting with the gauge actually set to regenerate, which we will now demonstrate. She's not one that really messes you up terribly or makes it too difficult to do what you're supposed to do by her having that regenerating gauge. And your own regenerating gauge generally doesn't give you a whole lot to worry about in that regard. It doesn't mess up anything that you'd be doing. So you having regenerating gauge is also fine. If you find that turning on the gauge changes her rhythm in a useful way, all the better to you. Go ahead and turn it on. Generally the moves she uses that actually activate in this way are not really something you care about terribly. With these inputs, she should almost never do forward moving attacks of that type in the EX form, and therefore there's really no problem. If anything, it makes her more likely to do very specific EX moves while under pressure from you, which is kind of what you want. The final part of the point system, which we are still researching once again, is the idea that you can in fact whiff punish her to see her sweep style attack with a lot of characters, but it is very difficult to do. Whereas with Akatsuki you have multiple things that you can whiff punish, and if you miss the first, you usually have a chance you'll keep on whiffing buttons for a little bit. Wagner will keep whiffing buttons, but unless you are extremely skilled, this generally means that you've missed your chance and are going to be defeated if you try to whiff punish anything other than the crouch or the 2C. Depending on your character, this is either really easy or really difficult. We have not yet found a character that we call this moderate difficulty. Obviously spacing does affect it, but if you're in a space where her normals are generally not catching you as a whole, and you don't feel terribly threatened, yes, that's generally how it is. It's either super hard to punish this, or really easy to punish it. Fortunately, she does not just constantly do this move, and in fact, with most rhythms for her inputs, she will not do this move straight up in neutral unless something weird has happened, as she's often going to hit 4A, 5B, and since she's not hitting you with either of those moves, it is more likely to be her long stance-y, her often charged stance-y that comes out, rather than the sweep. Sweep often follows things like backdashes or other specials that have brought her closer to you, or sometimes when she just managed to clip you with something as you were going into the air. The point is that generally you should not be able to see the sweep coming with its own really blatant tell and then whiff punish it. If you can, you may want to change some of the timing, but even then, it mostly matters relative to your own skill. Don't go bothering to try to change the timing so that the sweep is harder to see and therefore punish if you're not really succeeding at it in the first place. As you get better, since again you really have to re-input these bots every time you use them, as you become more comfortable with the inputs, you'll find that on any given day, the bot is slightly different. So far, our testing has been about 24 attempts at entering this bot from scratch and seeing what we get. And we have seen a range. But for the most part, the behaviors and abilities of the bot in question haven't changed enough to make us reconsider the main things that they're intended to do. This being the first one that I would actually mention, specifically that this point is meaningfully different in difficulty depending on whether or not she tends to stick out the button in neutral or not. So once again for her, move in, usually by running or dashing, hit a low, and move into a combo. If she moves away from you, or you have reason to believe that the low will fail, or that you had to block right after because you weren't sure, often you want to assault immediately. You get the point if you catch up with her backdash, and we are currently considering that you will get a point also if you catch up with a back jump. Though most of the time if you try to catch a back jump on Wagner, she'll just kill you anyway. And the bot tends to be particularly good at that. Take a point if you stop short because you feel you're going to get hit by her uppercut, and you are right, and she does the uppercut, and you then punish it. So most of this bot's timing is spent dashing forward at it, or waiting for it to do something in close range that you can with punish. If you are in close, you don't need to walk back out, wait for her to leave, or make a mistake of some form. She backdashes a bit more than most of the bots because of the timing on her own uppercut style move, and therefore when the backdash is available. If you find she is not backdashing too much, you may want to re-record the slot, what will be slot 3. It's usually quite easy to do the uppercut properly. Note that if you are particularly good and do uppercuts a little too well, it can in fact mess with the Akatsuki bot because he doesn't actually have an uppercut style move. But depending on what you do in terms of negative edge and so on, it affects how many projectiles he actually throws. We are not necessarily saying specifically make sure that he throws the projectiles all the time though, because the variation is kind of useful. Once you've gotten all of that, we move on to learning more advanced mechanics. And interestingly, we learn those more advanced mechanics with the base character, the poster boy of the game, Hyde himself. For Hyde, you generally want the auto recovering health back on, as he does a lot of damage, and most of the training involved requires you to be at heavy risk of being hit. However, you can reduce your health gauge back to 30% or so, just to give you that feeling of, I've made a mistake and there goes my health. Hyde is one of those characters who is able to uppercut you, but you sometimes need to be able to jump over his zoning or reposition yourself relative to it in ways that he won't immediately respond to. Since the character is so easily able to take up space in front of him with buttons, he often expects to do so, meaning that if you empty jump and he was late, he's either going to end up hitting your block, and he has almost all of his normals are basically negative, or you're going to get your own empty jump into low probably. So that is the first thing you're trying to do. It's usually quite a normal quick jump. You can use assault as well, but empty assault is a little bit easier to deal with and easier to see coming. So your goal is from about just outside his range, empty jump into a low that you then do combos for. Cross-ups are also helpful, but we have not decided yet whether or not this is useful enough to make universal. While aiming to do this empty jump low, you are also obviously going to punish his uppercut, especially if he whiffs it. And as with Akatsuki, you should, if he manages to throw his projectile, the red orbiter, from very close, or black orbiter actually. This move is also often punishable from extremely close range. Interestingly, by slightly more characters, as his is -7 at worst in a lot of cases, meaning that you generally get to come at him a little more. This is similar to a lot of his normals, as noted. Generally, if you're close in with Hyde, he wants to keep on hitting buttons, which brings us to the next point. Hyde has good strings that, while they are interruptible because many of his moves are negative, if he is doing them more in the Gatling style, he can push you out with block strings. And some of those lead into moves that you may not be expecting, such as charge force function, which is an overhead, or other slightly strange little things he does to push you out. One of your focuses in this position, therefore, is to actually use your reversal, which in this game is a quarter circle back and D while blocking. This requires you to have at least one bar of GRD gauge, as if you do not, it will cause a break of that gauge. You will not be able to use any of the functions anymore. Your goal, therefore, is to make sure you have that much, and to learn to do this relatively quickly or early if you think your opponent is going to continue. Hyde is less likely to throw in those chains than other characters using these bot inputs, giving you some time to get used to it. He's also likely to be slightly further away and help you get used to the spacing at which you should even try to do this. The more complex form of this, therefore, is to help you become used to the idea that you do not always have the gauge you think you do, because it would not be a good idea to use this reversal style attack just yet. Your opponent needs to land a couple more hits. There are other nuances to how this works. You can learn them as well through doing this. And generally, you're aiming to build up that gauge by doing the empty jump low, by understanding where you can put yourself relative to his uppercut style move, and similar. As with most such characters, if you do it just right, you can get that move to whiff by not sticking out any buttons of your own. For some characters, this really wasn't a big help. They were required to jump from close enough that they possibly could have been hit anyway, but there are definitely some that can just do it regardless of this. And a few who are surprisingly good at it. Generally, this is a character where you don't generally want to be standing so close to him in the first place, as at max range, how negative his normals are doesn't matter, and he's basically at advantage to you. So you often want to back away from Hyde a little bit and watch for your opportunities to make those jumps, to make other styles of approach, but unlike Wagner, you're generally not going to get through as easily if you dash. You're more likely to be able to land this empty jump, at least at beginner levels, or intermediate levels sometimes. And it will help you understand how the character flows. It also helps that more Hyde's combos are harder to do correctly on an opponent that he's poked out of the air. And he doesn't have a lot of instant conversions in that situation that lead to big damage or to the sort of knockdown pressure that he can get in other situations. So even if you don't really understand all of the nuances of it, being slightly in the air against him when trying to get in is definitely better than letting him get big combos on the ground. This version of the bot will use his ground explosion poke to keep you out. It will be able to use the orbiter very occasionally, usually after a whiffed or charge force function. And these are both openings for you and good zoning style tools for him, meaning that you have to think about it from both sides all the time. We do suggest that you spend some time making sure that you can anti-air him as well, but we are not giving the point for it as it's not specifically too difficult to do. He does not have the same level of air mobility or ways to change his jump arc as the other characters where you actually are intended to work on the anti-air first. But obviously, as with any bot that does jump, you want to be able to feel comfortable getting the anti-air if needed. He also has some moves that look like jumps but are not, but generally can be anti-aired as well in very similar ways without too much worry about it. So it's good to keep in mind. Since both sides are often aiming to do relatively large and well-known damage, we do keep the health regenerating as mentioned, and we will be obviously trying to work on a way to give Hyde some advantage. He's one of the characters who is most likely to land a specific type of thing that you could in fact keep count of, and by the time you are working on Hyde bot as a generality, it's probably likely that you can just count that he has hit you with his force function X amount of times, thrown you X amount of times, and so on, and just add them all up, and if he wins by count, then it's over. Since he is generally simplistic enough to be understood in that way as well, this is around the level of difficulty where we would be suggesting that you actually try to do that sort of thing. And keep in mind how many times a particular thing has happened to you, as well as the number of times that you have successfully done something you were supposed to do. So on that note, our suggestion for what to count is quite simply Hyde will get 1 point every time he lands a throw, every time he hits you with his full charge force function, and every time he hits you with Craver, his uppercut. Other moves tend to be more you misspaced yourself than you made a bad decision or did not realize something was about to happen. Note again that his full charge force function is not unblockable, but it is an overhead. In general, just block standing as soon as you see him charge this move in any form, because you're probably going to get hit by the uncharged version early enough that it doesn't matter. The bot generally should not do the uncharged version, as you were supposed to hold the BC when you started that. And some other interactions will shift it as well. Interestingly, in a few inputs he can in fact do the uncharge, but it has more to do with the fact that the BC is picked up later as an input. We have not seen this repeat very often, and we're not sure what caused it at the time it happened, but we'll let you know, of course, if we figure it out. The final bot that you can practice with just these inputs is another for whom we will keep basically this setup, the regenerating health, but we will take off the auto increasing ASS gauge because it's a little strange to leave in with it. You can put it on if you want to practice very specific things, but the core version of the bot does not have the auto increasing. We are of course referring to Chaos. I'll work in terms of understanding how Chaos works as a character in a bot form was to look at what he's able to do in terms of flow more so than what he's able to do theoretically. After observing some bits of the CPU and trying to get people used to the idea of this sort of what is often known as a puppet character, even though obviously he's not puppet. He is the puppet user, let's say. But if you are familiar with Street Fighter style games or Guilty Gear, his actual style of play is a bit closer to that of an offensive Guile or Leo Whitefang. While he does not necessarily have as many high-low mix-ups or similar, he does have a lot of control once he's very close to you, and he has a lot of surprising ways to stop you from getting close to him. If he's prepared enough anyway. So basing on that, the point system we have come up with for this bot is actually relatively simple. Take 1 point for any hit you can reasonably land when his Lizard Ajudahaka is on the other side of you. When the Lizard and Chaos are on opposite sides of you, hit Chaos. That's the only thing you need to do to get this point. It obviously is better if you can learn to do this with normals into combos rather than just hitting specials, but at this point, the easy version does not even require you to do that. Just hit him, as you really don't want to be stuck in this situation for too long in general. With most good inputs, the bot is actually able to keep this up for quite a while, as his force function does help with this and some other stuff he does as well. Secondarily, as long as he's not in the corner, or if he's only just arrived there because of something he did, and you find yourself more or less a full screen away, if you can get close to him and land an attack without ever actually blocking along the way, you can give yourself a point for that too. It does not matter how you get in, although you can choose to, of course, limit yourself based on your own character's requirements. And the only requirement from the other side is that you never actually end up blocking. Whether or not you hold back to reposition yourself is not relevant. And any evasion whatsoever is perfectly fine. Just do not find yourself in block stun on the way in to hit him. This actually can be more dangerous, but it's a matter of tracking a particular aspect of the character. This is outright and automatically easier when Ajidaka is not active or very close to Chaos or behind him. Because at least then you can gauge that the range, the space covered by the character is approximately a single sphere. You understand all of it and can therefore do as you need to. When Ajidaka is active, especially if it is mid-screen or similar, because with the current inputs, it does get to move around the stage somewhat. You cannot be as sure whether or not you will get all the way to him without something happening. And even when it's just disappeared, the rhythm of the inputs means that it's often that Chaos is about to move himself. You don't just get to walk up to him because you saw the lizard disappear. Chances are he's going to move, and you have to think about where he's going to move to, whether it will be a simple bat dash, in which case you are in no danger, jump toward you, assault through the air, or any number of things, to either deny you your hit or actually counter you altogether on your approach. We chose to suggest that the health regenerate, as this takes a long time to get used to. And honestly, the way that Chaos's damage works in the form of what we have available now, we have not managed to come up with anything advanced enough that is likely to out-damage a player doing this seriously. Once you can get in, you should hit him. And you should generally hit him quite hard. The requirement, of course, is that you are only able to get that point if you were at nearly full screen to begin with. You do not, however, necessarily need to retreat there all the time, as being close to him means that there's a higher chance that he and Aji will be on opposite sides of you, and therefore you will get that point. Still, it can quickly become quite clear why you want to sometimes be far away from him. Taking stock more clearly of where his pet is, what he's trying to do, and treating him like a very powerful zoner can help quite a lot in understanding these things. You do need to get in on him, and he will use every trick in the book to prevent you from doing that, literally. But knowing at which time to jump, how close you can be in front of the lizard before you do certain types of jump to avoid being counter-hit, how far from Chaos you need to be to avoid being counter-hit by Chaos himself, and all of these things contribute to this. The third and fourth point systems are related to anti-airs and throws once again. These may change as we are still doing all the final touches up on this particular approach. But Chaos does not jump that often, and more importantly, when he does jump, Ajidaka is usually still near you, making you feel less comfortable about the anti-air, for good reason, as him being in the air does not stop the lizard from attacking at all. Meaning that you have to spend a lot more time thinking about if you can reach him in time in the air to make sure that you don't get hit on the way up, or have any other problems. making the anti-air point on this bot much more important and difficult to get anyway. Throwing him, on the other hand, is not generally as hard. You can mostly manage to throw him once Aji's out of the way, and you don't get hit during the throw, which is actually there primarily because, well, it's a good way to deal with him. Therefore, we are currently researching whether or not it is important that you can do this because it is a good strategy against Chaos as a whole, or if the bot inputs make it too easy for you to do this overall, and therefore would teach you very little. It is at least somewhat likely that we will modify it in some way, so for now, feel free to experiment with this, try to figure out what could actually make this throw difficult enough to land that you actually have to care about it, and perhaps look into some high-level play of this character and figure out why you would need to throw and what would generally be preventing you from doing so. This game is relatively simple by most standards. There is not a lot of super complex per character stuff to work out in terms of punishing this or approaching this specific thing they do in this exact way. And with the number of options your characters tend to have and the number of universal options available, mostly you need to understand reach and sometimes startup frames as mentioned before, which you can find once again on wiki.mizuumi.net, and just navigate to Under Night in Birth, i.e. UNIST section, and you'll find everything you need there. There's no need for a frame data app at this time or similar things, but if you know of any, then please let us know and we'll pass it along to the community at large. We will of course be working on more bots. We have quite a few of them who we know the inputs for, and have been working on which can further share those inputs and more advanced ways of learning, as the 6 bots we have mentioned today are mostly about helping you get used to UNIST, even if the thing you're getting used to is relatively difficult to execute. It's not necessarily super complicated if you know how to play the game, or it can be used to help you learn how to play the game. Hence the starter kit concept that these 6 bots represent. In the coming weeks, therefore, you can look forward to either more advanced or more specific bots, or equivalent of expansions, i.e. DLC. Which are probably going to be more complicated this guidance, as we will in fact be showing off the inputs for those, as we would not have had an entire stream to do that previously. Even if they are the same inputs we used in that Robotics Lab, this is the only stream where we will be using the Robotics Lab itself as the reference for those who do not yet have anything up on the website. Once again, you can get that on Sunday, probably around 6 or 7 Eastern, possibly a bit before. Each bot page will be separate even though the inputs are duplicated, as they each require slightly different information about what might go wrong if you try the input a particular way, even if you do just always put them all as inputs on Wagner. If you did find anything strange, we consider it helpful to be able to reference, oh, do I need to fix this for this bot or is it okay? And therefore, they will all be kept on separate pages with a reference to the fact that they are all functionally Wagner inputs. So with that, this has been brilliant, along with Just Fine on the controller. 14 2MK. Good luck with your training, and good night everyone.